Mark and Rachel, newlyweds from Oregon, were embarking on what they hoped would be a life-changing honeymoon. Portland, Oregon, had always been on their bucket list, a city filled with beauty, culture, and endless adventure. A place that seemed perfect for their first trip as a married couple, a place where they could explore together, create memories, and start their new chapter surrounded by the charm of the Pacific Northwest. Portland, known for its eclectic culture and scenic landscapes, was everything they had hoped for. Mark, 32, and Rachel, 29, had been together for 5 years before they tied the knot. Their love story was one that many envied, strong, supportive, and full of promise. They met in college, both sharing a love for adventure and travel. They built a life together in Oregon, sharing an apartment in a small neighborhood just outside of Portland. Their relationship had always been filled with laughter, mutual respect, and trust. They had been inseparable, and everyone who knew them could see that they were a perfect match. But what they didn't know was that this trip would be anything but perfect. The honeymoon, meant to celebrate their love, would soon lead them down a path no one could have predicted. What was supposed to be a romantic getaway quickly turned into a horrifying ordeal that would change both of their lives forever. They had planned every detail of their honeymoon, visiting Portland's famous art galleries, exploring the local farmers' markets, dining in trendy restaurants, and experiencing the beauty of the Pacific Northwest. Rachel had always dreamed of walking through the lush forests near Multnomah Falls, and Mark was eager to try Portland's famous food scene. It was supposed to be a celebration of their love, an escape from the daily grind, and a chance to finally relax and enjoy the start of their marriage. Their itinerary was packed with adventures. From renting bikes to explore the city to taking a trip out to the coast to visit Cannon Beach, where the famous Haystack Rock stood tall against the crashing waves. It was all going according to plan, at least, it seemed that way at first. But just a few days into their dream honeymoon, everything started to feel off. It was subtle at first, something Rachel couldn't quite put her finger on. At dinner one evening, after a day spent touring the city, Mark seemed distant. His usually jovial demeanor had given way to a coldness Rachel hadn't noticed before. When she asked him if something was bothering him, Mark brushed her off with a smile, claiming that he was just tired. Yet Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. It wasn't just the new environment or the long days of travel. She started to feel as if the city, which was supposed to be a romantic escape, was now suffocating her. Portland, with all its beauty and charm, suddenly seemed like a place where secrets were lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Rachel wondered if it was just stress from the wedding, but as the days went on, she began to sense a shift in Mark's behavior. He became less engaged with her, more distracted, and even more withdrawn. The excitement they had shared on their first day in Portland seemed to evaporate, replaced by a growing tension between them. Was it the pressure of their honeymoon? Or was there something more happening that Rachel couldn't yet see? By the 4th day of their honeymoon, things would take a turn that neither of them could have anticipated. What started as a beautiful vacation would soon unravel into a nightmare, a shocking tragedy that neither Mark nor Rachel could ever have imagined. As the days continued, Rachel found herself more and more isolated. Mark was no longer the person she had married. He spent hours on his phone, seemingly glued to the screen, and every time she tried to talk to him about their plans for the day, he would dismiss her suggestions or come up with excuses to avoid spending time together. It wasn't just the physical distance between them, it was emotional as well. Mark had always been supportive and loving, but now Rachel felt a growing sense of disconnect. It was as though something was keeping him at arm's length. She noticed the change, and it made her uneasy. What made matters worse was the fact that Mark wasn't the only one acting strange. Rachel began to question her own feelings, wondering if maybe the stress of the wedding had caused her to overthink things. Was she simply imagining problems where none existed? But as the honeymoon progressed, Rachel became more attuned to the small, unsettling details, the way Mark's smile no longer reached his eyes, how he seemed distracted and irritable even in the most beautiful settings. When they went out for dinner one night, they sat at a cozy table for two, and Mark hardly spoke. He was polite, but distant, barely making eye contact with Rachel. She had tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were curt and unenthusiastic. It wasn't until the night they went to a well-known Portland bar that things took a turn for the worse. As they sat in a booth, enjoying cocktails and small talk, Rachel caught Mark glancing at his phone multiple times. Each time, his expression shifted. His eyes hardened, and he briefly looked up at her before returning his attention to the screen. He seemed agitated, as though he was hiding something. After dinner, Mark suggested they head back to the hotel early. But Rachel, sensing something was amiss, suggested they go for a walk along the river. She wanted to reconnect with him, to try and fix whatever was wrong. They had only been married for a week, after all, this wasn't how she imagined their honeymoon would be. But as they walked along the water's edge, Mark seemed to pull away even further. The coldness between them was palpable. What had happened to the man who had held her hand during their wedding day, the man who had promised to love her no matter what? That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay awake in their hotel room, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything that had happened in the last few days. Was it just wedding stress? Or was there something else? What could possibly explain Mark's behavior? And more importantly, why was he suddenly so distant, so cold, when he had been nothing but loving before? The next day, things would take a darker turn. Rachel found a text message on Mark's phone, one that had been sent late at night. The message was from a name she didn't recognize, Jessica. It was a simple text, just a few words: "I miss you. Can't wait to see you soon." Rachel's heart sank. She had never heard of Jessica, and the message was vague enough to raise suspicion. Who was this person, and why was Mark texting them at this time? Was this another sign of something bigger? When Rachel confronted Mark about the message, his response was quick but defensive. He brushed it off, claiming it was a misunderstanding, an old friend from work who had just reached out. But Rachel could feel the unease building within her. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Something wasn't right. Something was being hidden from her. What started as a perfect trip began to shift in subtle ways. At first, it was minor. Mark's patience seemed to wear thin, and his behavior became erratic. The things he used to enjoy, like sightseeing or trying new foods, no longer seemed appealing to him. They had visited several coffee shops in Portland, known for their rich and unique brews, but Mark barely touched his coffee. His once enthusiastic smile was replaced by a blank stare, and he seemed distant, as if lost in thought. Rachel, always the optimist, tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the stress of the wedding. After all, they had planned every detail meticulously, and the pressure of being newlyweds could have affected Mark. She told herself that it would pass, that the excitement of the trip would bring him back to the man she knew and loved. But by the second day, the tension between them was palpable. They began to argue over the smallest things, directions, meals, and even their plans for the evening. "I just don't get why you're so upset," Rachel said one afternoon as they sat at a cafe. "We're in a beautiful city, why can't we just enjoy it?" Mark's eyes flashed with irritation. "I'm not upset, Rachel. I just need some space." His tone was sharper than usual, and his words stung more than they should have. Rachel, hurt and confused, tried to respond, but he was already lost in his thoughts again, staring at the busy street, his mind seemingly a million miles away. As the days passed, Rachel's concerns deepened. She began to wonder if their honeymoon was turning into something more than just a minor miscommunication. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface of Mark's mood swings. Was it just stress from the wedding? Or was there something else at play? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she knew about her husband's state of mind during their trip. She had always known Mark to be an open person, someone who would share his thoughts and feelings with her, but now he was becoming a stranger. She noticed it more when they were alone, in the quiet moments where they would typically bond. Mark would stare off into the distance at times, lost in thought, as if his mind was preoccupied with something far more important than the trip they had planned. Rachel tried to approach him, to ask what was wrong, but his answers were curt, cold, and even dismissive. When she asked how he was feeling, he simply replied, "Fine," with no further explanation. It was as if he was pulling away, but not in the way one would expect during a honeymoon. The love, the connection they had shared for years, seemed to slip through her fingers. The emotional distance between them grew with each passing day. At first, Rachel told herself it was part of the honeymoon phase, the exhaustion, the adjustment to being married, the unfamiliarity of travel. But deep down, Rachel knew something was wrong. Mark wasn't the same. She would catch him looking at her with a cold, almost vacant stare, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Sometimes, when they were having a conversation, Mark's responses felt rehearsed, like he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear, not what he truly felt. Something wasn't adding up. One morning, they had planned to visit the Portland Japanese Garden, a tranquil spot known for its serenity and beauty. But as they entered the gates, Mark barely reacted. The beauty of the place, the peaceful atmosphere, it should have been the perfect moment to reconnect. But instead, Mark seemed more agitated. His eyes darted around, as though he was looking for an escape. "I'm not really in the mood for this," he muttered under his breath. Rachel was taken aback. This was supposed to be one of the highlights of their trip. "What do you mean?" "It's beautiful here," she said, trying to make light of the situation. But Mark wasn't having it. He turned to her with a look of frustration. "I don't care. We've been walking around all day. I need some space." Rachel's heart sank. What had happened to the man she had married? She had always known Mark to be patient, kind, and understanding, but now he seemed like a stranger. She tried to brush off the incident, thinking maybe it was just a rough morning. But deep down, she felt the tension building between them, something that had been slowly festering beneath the surface. Each day, it became harder to ignore. Was it the city? The new environment? Or was it something about their relationship that had shifted? The more Rachel tried to reason with herself, the more she realized that she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What started as a small discomfort, the subtle signs of tension between them, had become a full-blown problem. The arguments, the coldness, the avoidance, it was all starting to add up in a way that made Rachel feel increasingly uneasy. Was this a honeymoon nightmare she had imagined? Or was it something far worse? By the 5th day of their honeymoon, the divide between them was unmissable. Rachel started spending more time on her own, walking through the city's charming streets, visiting art galleries, and exploring shops on her own. She had always loved solo adventures, but this time, it felt different. The loneliness that had begun to creep in during the trip was now overwhelming. Mark had become distant, and no matter how hard Rachel tried to bridge the gap, she was always met with cold silence or a dismissive shrug. It wasn't until the evening of their last night in Portland that Rachel finally gathered the courage to confront him. The tension between them was at a breaking point, and she couldn't bear the emotional distance any longer. But when she asked Mark about the tension, about the coldness she had been feeling, he grew defensive. "What's your problem?" Mark snapped. "I'm fine. It's you who's acting strange." His voice was sharp, laced with irritation. "Can't you just let me have some space? Why are you always trying to make something out of nothing?" Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the man who had promised to support her, no matter what. The realization hit her hard. Whatever had been brewing under the surface of their marriage had now come to the forefront. Rachel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words she had been holding back. "I'm not trying to make something out of nothing, Mark. But something's wrong. Something is different, and I need to know what's going on with you." By the 4th day of their trip, the tension finally boiled over. Mark, who had seemed distant and cold for days, suddenly snapped. The argument escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, voices were raised, and Rachel realized too late that the man she had married had become someone she didn't recognize. It all started with a small comment from Rachel, something about Mark's strange behavior that day, his reluctance to join in their plans, his sudden, sharp responses to the simplest questions. She thought it would be just another argument. But this time, it wasn't. "You're always on my back about something," Mark snapped, his voice rising. "Can't you just let me be? I'm not in the mood for this, okay?" Rachel, desperate for some kind of understanding, tried to calmly explain, but the more she spoke, the more Mark's anger grew. What began as a simple exchange of frustrations turned into an intense verbal confrontation. And just when Rachel thought they were both too tired to argue any further, Mark's anger reached a breaking point. "Why don't you just get off my back?" Mark shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. The glass of wine Rachel was holding tipped over, spilling across the table. The sudden force made Rachel's heart race, but what she couldn't have known was that this was only the beginning. Mark's face twisted with rage, and in that moment, the person she thought she knew, the man she had married, was gone. He no longer looked like the man who had held her hand at their wedding. The person standing before her was someone she couldn't understand, someone she feared. In a sudden outburst of violence, Mark lunged at Rachel. His hands, once gentle, gripped her with an unnatural strength. Rachel, stunned and in complete shock, struggled to break free, but the force behind Mark's hold was overwhelming. She cried out for help, but the room was too quiet, the noise of their argument having drowned out everything else. As the days passed after the incident, Rachel's fears grew. Her face bruised, her body sore, she retreated into a shell of herself, too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened. She couldn't believe it, this was not the man she had married. It wasn't just a heated argument. It was an attack, and it was one that marked a point of no return. Rachel finally summoned the courage to contact the authorities, but even then, the reality of what had happened was too overwhelming to process fully. A police report would later reveal that during the argument, Mark had lost control and attacked Rachel with violent force. The rage that had been building in him for days finally came to a head in that moment, and Rachel tried to fight back, but the strength Mark exhibited was too much for her. But as investigators delved deeper into Mark's history, they uncovered startling details. Things that Rachel could never have imagined. Mark had a past, one that he had worked tirelessly to hide. Investigators would soon uncover shocking details about Mark's past that no one could have predicted. Mark, it seemed, had a history of violent tendencies. Violent outbursts, emotional instability, and even previous abusive relationships that had been swept under the rug. He had been arrested once before for a violent altercation with a former girlfriend, but the charges had been dropped when the victim chose not to press them. As the investigation unraveled, another disturbing detail came to light. Mark had been in therapy years before, dealing with anger management issues. His counselor, however, had no idea that he was still struggling with these deep-rooted issues. Mark had told the therapist that he had moved on from his past, but the truth was, the anger had never truly left him. One of the most chilling revelations came when it was discovered that Mark had been keeping journals that detailed his thoughts and feelings about Rachel. The entries revealed an unsettling pattern of controlling behavior and resentment. The journals painted a picture of a man who felt entitled to Rachel, someone who believed that his actions and his needs should always come first. As investigators continued to dig deeper into Mark's personal life, they found more unsettling details. His journals weren't just about Rachel, they were about his entire life. Each entry highlighted his frustrations with relationships, his feelings of being wronged by those closest to him. It was clear from the journals that Mark had struggled with feelings of control and jealousy for years, but had kept these emotions well hidden from everyone around him. His outbursts had been a part of his life, but Rachel never suspected they could be more than just a rough patch in their relationship. But the more they examined Mark's past, the more the picture became clear. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was the culmination of years of suppressed rage, jealousy, and possessiveness. What seemed like a spontaneous argument during their honeymoon had been the breaking point in a series of escalating behaviors that had been buried for years. While the focus had been on Mark from the start, new questions emerged as the investigation continued. Had anyone else been involved in this tragedy? Was there someone else behind the scenes, pulling the strings? As police dug into Mark's communications, they uncovered some surprising messages, texts to a mysterious woman named Emily. At first, Rachel thought these were simply messages to a friend. But after further investigation, it was revealed that Mark and Emily had been communicating regularly, in secret. It turned out that Emily had been a part of Mark's life long before Rachel came into the picture. Could this other woman have played a role in Mark's state of mind? Did Emily's presence in Mark's life contribute to his emotional breakdown? The question of whether this was truly a crime of passion or a deep-rooted issue that Mark had struggled with for years loomed large as investigators considered all angles. Rachel, still grappling with the shock of what had happened, began to question everything. Was there more to the story than she had realized? Did she truly know the man she had married? The investigation ultimately revealed that Mark's rage had been building for months before the honeymoon. It wasn't just the wedding stress, it was years of suppressed emotions, past trauma, and an unaddressed need for control. When Rachel tried to stand up for herself, when she questioned him and his behavior, it was the final trigger that set off a violent chain of events. Mark, now facing charges for his actions, remained in denial. His lawyer argued that the attack was an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the evidence told a different story. It was clear that Mark's behavior had been part of a much darker pattern that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Rachel had always been a loving, caring person. She was a dreamer, someone who believed in the goodness of people, always giving others the benefit of the doubt. She had a warm heart, always quick to help anyone in need. To her family and friends, Rachel was a beacon of light, an easygoing, joyful person whose laughter was infectious, whose kindness knew no bounds. Her family described her as full of life, someone who could light up any room with her smile. They saw her as the type of person who gave without expecting anything in return. Throughout her life, Rachel always put others before herself, always striving to make everyone around her feel seen and appreciated. She believed in true love, and her relationship with Mark had been proof of that. To her, Mark wasn't just a husband, he was her rock, her best friend, the one person she could rely on. Rachel's love for Mark was clear. She had always trusted him, believed in their future together, and was excited to begin their new life as a married couple. The honeymoon, their first trip as a married couple, was supposed to be a dream come true, something they would look back on fondly for the rest of their lives. But what happened on that honeymoon would change everything, shattering Rachel's world in an instant. Rachel's family, who had been so excited for her wedding and honeymoon, could never have imagined the horror that would unfold in Portland. They were proud of her, thrilled to see their daughter embark on a new chapter, but they could never have anticipated the violence and heartbreak that awaited her. Rachel wasn't just a victim in their eyes, she was a symbol of love, of hope, and of the promise of a bright future. And yet, that future was violently stolen away. Mark's actions sent shockwaves through both of their families. How could someone so full of promise, someone who had been trusted with the heart of their daughter, become capable of such unspeakable violence? This question lingered in the minds of Rachel's parents as they tried to comprehend the devastation that had occurred. They had always believed Mark was a kind, respectful man. He had been a part of their family for years, sharing holidays and family gatherings, always seemingly polite and caring. How could they have been so blind? "I just don't understand," Rachel's mother whispered through her tears. "How could he do that to her? How could he do that to us? She was our baby. She was kind and loving. She deserved so much more than this. She deserved happiness. She didn't deserve to die like this." Rachel's mother, heartbroken and in disbelief, found herself questioning everything she knew about Mark. The man she had welcomed into their family was now a man accused of murder. She could no longer see him through the lens of her daughter's husband, he had become a stranger to her, a monster she could never have predicted. "Mark was family to me," Rachel's father said, his voice trembling. "I trusted him like a son. I always thought he was a good man. He was always respectful, always seemed to love Rachel. I can't wrap my head around it. What went wrong?" The emotional toll on Rachel's parents was unimaginable. Their world had been turned upside down in a matter of days. The daughter they had loved and cherished for so long was gone, taken in the most violent way possible. And the person responsible for her death was someone they had invited into their lives, someone they had trusted, someone who had been a part of their family for years. Their grief was compounded by the sense of betrayal. How could they not have seen the darkness that had always been there, lurking beneath Mark's facade? But it wasn't just Rachel's family that was left in turmoil, Mark's family was equally devastated by the truth. They had known Mark for most of his life. To them, he had always been the quiet, sensitive type. The one who could be counted on in times of need, the son they had raised with love and care. He had always seemed so capable of deep affection. His mother had seen him as a protector, a person who would always have his family's best interests at heart. When the news broke, Mark's mother was in shock. She had raised him with love and discipline, never once imagining he was capable of such violence. Her world crumbled as the horrifying details of Rachel's death came to light. She had always believed her son was good, kind-hearted, someone who would never hurt a soul. And now, she was faced with the impossible reality that her son had taken the life of the woman he had promised to love forever. "I raised him to be a good man," she said quietly, tears in her eyes. "I don't understand how this could have happened. Mark was always so gentle, so kind. How did he become this?" Mark's father, too, was left reeling. He spent sleepless nights questioning everything he knew about his son. How had Mark hidden his true nature from them? How had he concealed the rage and emotional instability that had ultimately led to the tragic events in Portland? The pain of losing their daughter-in-law was compounded by the fact that their own flesh and blood was responsible for it. As the investigation continued, the families became divided. Rachel's family, understandably, wanted justice. They couldn't fathom how anyone could forgive Mark for what he had done. To them, there was no way to make sense of the violence, no way to reconcile the man they had known with the one accused of such heinous actions. On the other side, Mark's family struggled with the reality of the situation. They wanted to believe that their son wasn't capable of what he had done. They desperately searched for explanations, hoping for a sign that this was just a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. But deep down, they knew the truth, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The divide between the families grew wider as the case progressed. Rachel's family wanted Mark to face the full consequences of his actions. But Mark's family, still in denial, clung to the hope that there was some explanation for the events that led to Rachel's death. The grief from both sides was overwhelming, but in different ways. Rachel's family could not move forward until they saw justice for their daughter, while Mark's family struggled to come to terms with the fact that their son was the one who had caused this irreparable pain. For Rachel's family, the loss was unbearable. They had lost their daughter, the one they had watched grow up and build a life of her own. The pain of knowing she would never walk through their door again, never share another meal with them, was something they couldn't escape. Each day was filled with an ache, a longing for a future that could have been. But as the months passed, Rachel's family began to find a way to cope. They turned their grief into action, speaking out about the dangers of emotional abuse and manipulation. They worked with support groups and raised awareness about the signs of controlling behavior in relationships. They wanted Rachel's death to mean something, to be the catalyst for change. It was a way to honor her memory and ensure that her story would help others. Mark's family, on the other hand, struggled in silence. The shame they felt was overwhelming, and many of them chose to retreat from the public eye. They had to come to terms with a painful reality: the son they had loved and raised was capable of committing the unthinkable. The emotional toll on them was profound, but the guilt was too heavy for them to bear. They began to wonder if they had missed something along the way, if there were signs they had ignored that might have prevented this tragedy. Rachel was more than just a victim, she was a symbol of love, hope, and the fragility of trust. Her life, full of promise and potential, was tragically cut short by someone who had vowed to protect her. Her family, devastated by the loss, found solace in knowing that she would not be forgotten. The love Rachel had given to the world would live on, even as the pain of her loss remained. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the violence was not a spontaneous outburst, it was part of a long, hidden history. Investigators delved deeper into Mark's past, and the layers of his secret life began to peel away. What they discovered was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Mark had a history of anger issues, a deep-seated struggle with controlling behavior, and multiple violent outbursts that had been swept under the rug or ignored by those around him. The full truth about Mark's psychological state came to light. He had been struggling with unresolved emotional turmoil for years, but had cleverly concealed it from those closest to him. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface had been carefully hidden, buried under the mask of charm and civility he presented to the world. To the outside world, Mark was the perfect husband, the kind of man you would invite to your home, the kind of person who could be counted on in times of need. But that was all a carefully constructed facade. Rachel had no idea that Mark had dealt with anger management issues even before they met. He had been to therapy in his younger years, but the sessions were short-lived, and his issues had never been fully addressed. He often spoke of them with the same cold indifference that he showed to other aspects of his life. And those who knew him, his family, his colleagues, never questioned the quiet intensity that seemed to define him. No one had seen the cracks in his armor until it was far too late. Rachel's honeymoon in Portland, meant to celebrate their new life together, had become the tipping point for a man whose emotional and psychological struggles had reached their breaking point. The idyllic city, full of life and beauty, now stood as the backdrop for the explosion of years of pent-up anger. Mark's emotional neglect had been building for months, perhaps years, and when Rachel began to push back against the subtle shifts in their relationship, Mark snapped. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a police officer uncovered a series of documents from Mark's earlier life. It turned out that Mark had been involved in a few violent incidents in his past, incidents that had been quietly swept aside. There was one particularly striking incident from his college days, when he had been arrested for a physical altercation with a former girlfriend. The charge was dismissed after a private settlement was reached. The details of that night had remained hidden for years, as the people involved had opted for discretion over justice. One of his ex-girlfriends, who had been silent for years, finally came forward to tell her story. She recalled how Mark's behavior had changed over time, how he had become increasingly possessive, controlling, and violent. She described instances where he would belittle her, manipulate her emotionally, and lash out in anger when he felt threatened. The more she spoke, the more the pieces fell into place. What Rachel had been experiencing during their honeymoon was not isolated, it was just another outburst in a long history of destructive behavior. Mark had always found ways to cover his tracks, to make others believe his facade. But his pattern was becoming clearer, the charming, loving husband on the surface, and the deeply troubled, abusive partner beneath. What investigators soon discovered was the real trigger for Mark's violent outburst during the honeymoon, an old wound that had never healed. Mark had always felt a deep sense of inadequacy, struggling with issues of control and vulnerability. Rachel, who had always been confident and independent, had begun to challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She had started to push back against his controlling tendencies, standing up for herself and questioning his decisions. This, in Mark's eyes, was an affront to his authority. It shattered the illusion he had carefully constructed of being in control of his life, and of their relationship. As the pressure of the honeymoon mounted, Mark's emotional restraint snapped. The situation, which had been building for months, finally exploded on that fateful day. His aggression, long suppressed, had nowhere to go. Rachel, caught in the middle of his emotional storm, had become the target of his anger. What Rachel had seen as a small disagreement was, in reality, the the culmination of months of emotional control, manipulation, and aggression. The honeymoon that was supposed to be a fresh start had now become a nightmare that neither of them could escape from. As investigators continued to piece together Mark's history, they uncovered one final, chilling detail: Mark had been carrying around a deep, unresolved trauma from his childhood. He had grown up in a household where emotional neglect and physical punishment were common. His father had been cold and distant, often resorting to harsh discipline when Mark acted out. His mother, while loving, had been emotionally unavailable, leaving Mark to navigate the emotional turmoil of his youth without guidance. This unresolved trauma had festered over the years, contributing to Mark's inability to form healthy emotional connections. His feelings of worthlessness and insecurity had been amplified by the constant need for control. The honeymoon, a time meant for joy, had instead become the breaking point for a man whose inner demons had been simmering for decades. But what was most shocking of all was that Mark had never acknowledged these emotional issues. He had buried them deep within himself, afraid to confront them. Instead, he channeled his pain into control, and when Rachel began to push back, he could no longer suppress the rage inside him. He had no escape, and Rachel became the target of his fury. Mark's violent outburst was not just the result of a sudden loss of control. It was the culmination of years of suppressed anger, emotional pain, and psychological turmoil. The truth was clear: Mark had never truly been the person Rachel had thought he was. He had been hiding a part of himself from her, the part that was capable of such darkness. And now, as the investigation uncovered more details about Mark's past, the full scope of his psychological state came to light. It was no longer just about a violent argument or a crime of passion. It was about a deep-seated issue that had affected every aspect of Mark's life and relationships. The honeymoon had been the final straw, but the truth about who Mark truly was would be something that Rachel never could have prepared for. The story of Rachel Williams is a tragic reminder that no one can ever truly know what's lurking beneath the surface. Mark's actions were shocking, but they also serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unaddressed mental health issues, unchecked anger, and the devastating consequences of hidden violence. Mark's ability to hide his emotional turmoil behind a facade of charm and control is something that, in retrospect, is chilling. It's a stark reminder that even those we trust the most can harbor dark secrets that, when left unchecked, can lead to catastrophic consequences. Rachel, like so many others, believed in the goodness of the person she married. She trusted Mark, perhaps more than she trusted anyone else in the world. What happened to her could happen to anyone, because the signs of abuse, the signs of control, are often subtle. They don't show up all at once. They creep in slowly, disguised as care and affection, until they begin to take root and grow, leaving the victim powerless to break free. But Rachel's story is not just one of tragedy. It's a story that, in the end, will be remembered. Her death won't be forgotten, and the lessons learned from her life and the horrors she faced will hopefully help others to recognize the signs of manipulation, control, and abuse before it's too late. Her family, though heartbroken, will honor her memory by fighting to ensure that what happened to Rachel does not happen to anyone else. If you've been affected by this story, or if you've experienced similar situations, please reach out to local support organizations. There are people who understand what you're going through and who can help you take the first step towards healing. Whether it's emotional support, therapy, or resources for those affected by domestic violence, don't be afraid to ask for help. You're not alone in this. The camera slowly transitions to a list of helpline numbers and website links for support organizations dedicated to domestic violence survivors, therapy resources, and mental health services. And for those of you who want to continue uncovering the darkest corners of the world, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. This is just one of many true crime stories we will explore, shedding light on cases that are often hidden in the shadows. We believe that through awareness and education, we can prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Join us next time as we take you deeper into the world of unsolved mysteries, emotional trauma, and the chilling events that have forever changed the lives of those involved. We're committed to telling these stories, not just to inform, but to help others recognize the signs and break free from dangerous situations before it's too late. If you or someone you know is experiencing emotional or physical abuse, please seek help immediately.